So while I'm kind of waiting for it, if I might be able to confess, some of these have been really tough. That one on 1 Corinthians 15 is tough. The one next time, I didn't say next week. There's a reason for that. Next time is going to be 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, the man of sin. Those are tough. And I have been to the point where it's like I wish that I just get through those as fast as possible and hope that I don't make too much of a confusing mess out of it. But this one is actually one that I've looked forward to. Not because of its difficulty, because it's a tough text, but if I ranked it from 1 to 10, it wouldn't be the toughest one. But what I do like about the fact that's going to take me more than just today to talk about is that I'm going to incorporate some elements of when I heard Jim doing this lesson in the Philippines 25 years ago. And I took notes on a pad, like a little bitty notepad. So when, I realize that when I stand up and when I talk, there's thousands of words. I mean, literally, you can quantify it. There's thousands of words that come out. And you're not going to remember the majority of them. But there's going to be little nuggets that someone like Nathan is going to remember for 25 years. And that's pretty neat when you think about it. That's pretty powerful when you think about that. Just like I had remembered portions of this because I wrote it down with Jim 25 years ago in a country that's 8,000 miles away. It's so neat. So I've been looking forward to this one the whole time as we've been getting through these different ones to Matthew chapter 24. So what does Matthew chapter 24 and these passages, what does Matthew chapter 24, 34 through 36 say? What does it say? Someone read it for us.
Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass, till all these things shall be fulfilled. Heaven and earth shall pass away, and my word shall not pass away.
So the difficulty of this passage, what do you think makes this passage difficult? What do you think makes this passage difficult? I think in our explanation of it, it won't be as difficult. Nevertheless, it has been a difficult passage. So think far beyond what James just read. What makes this a difficult passage, do you think? Okay, the idea of this generation, which we are going to deal with, think even bigger. More complicated as far as the context is concerned. Okay. Heaven and earth passing away. A lot of people think that Matthew 24 is detailing what? The end of the world. They think that Matthew 24 is detailing specifically two elements of the end of the world, or at least getting closer to the end of the world, and that is the tribulation and the rapture, the Antichrist. The battle of Armageddon. That all of this is wrapped up in Matthew chapter 24. And that's actually what makes it a difficult text. There is a side difficulty to it. I don't know that that's as difficult. The side difficulty, especially among, more intentional Bible students, is does Matthew 24:36 mark a distinction in the text where Jesus moves on to another subject, or does that happen elsewhere? That's going to be up for us to debate in just a few minutes, but most of this is because of the premillennial concerns. What section do you think especially? Now, in Matthew chapter 24, we read, closer to the 2/3 of the way through the chapter, but what section do you think more so do people in a premillennial way like today? What section do you think? Well, yes. And as you look in Matthew 24, you kind of start glancing down through there. What's one of the first things that kind of catches your eye that have caught other people's eyes? Maybe the what? The wars and the rumors of wars. So how many active conflicts do we have going on? You know, the UN defines an active conflict, and I've forgotten, it's been a long time, I've forgotten what the definition of an active conflict is. But how many countries are there in the world? I asked this in my Wednesday night class, and someone knew it like instantly. I couldn't believe it. I have to look this stuff up. And even then, the number that I'm going to give you, remember, is highly debated. How many countries are there in the world? About 195. And surprisingly, in about a quarter of them, there's armed conflict. So when you talk about wars and rumors of wars, of course, depending on where you are in the world, there's always what? There's always that. There's always wars and rumors of wars. Then when you have wars and rumors of wars, you have a certain particular person maybe. Vladimir Putin, who becomes kind of at least a couple of years ago, was kind of center stage in all of the wars and the rumors of wars that were going on with Russia and the Ukraine. So there might be people who would identify him as the what? As the Antichrist. So much premillennial speculation comes along. And particularly, again, as you read in Matthew chapter 24, and we get to language like is found in verse, in verse 21, there will be what? There will be great tribulation. 24, there's going to be false Christs. Matthew is going to describe as Jesus is telling it in verse 29. Now what's going to happen? The sun will be darkened, like we just had an eclipse. The moon will what? Will not give its light, like we have when we have an eclipse. And you might think, well, I mean, that's ridiculous. But there are people literally who teach and who tell people that the end of the world is coming when we have these regular astronomical events, that it's a sign that the tribulation is nigh. And I think that, in just summing that up and kind of tying this off, that is what makes that's what makes this text difficult. Not so much the actual structure of the text, or even as we work through it. I think it'll be readily easy to grasp, but it's what people do with it that make it not just so tough, but honestly dangerous. So why is it dangerous? I mean, why is it not just someone else's opinion? Why is it dangerous? Because you change the nature of the Scriptures. You know, Paul talked about in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 4, that when people came and they changed the nature of Jesus, they were preaching a what? A different Jesus. And so when I start changing people's expectation of hope, people's expectation of the future, I'm preaching a different what? Jesus. I'm preaching a different gospel. Galatians chapter 1. If you do that, you're what? You're accursed. I'll admit that there are some issues in the New Testament where does it mean this or does it mean that? It comes down to, honestly, an academic exercise. It could be one or the other, and both of them have equal merit. Honestly, both of them have equal weight. But this is not one of those. It radically changes the nature of what's coming if you begin to look at this incorrectly. This is why it's a tough text. So let's kind of consider it in the context. And the context doesn't actually begin in Matthew 24, verse 1. It begins earlier. In what setting is all of this section of Scripture, from basically Matthew 21 on. What is taking place? Where are we in time? Where are we in time in Matthew 21 forward? Matthew 21, Jesus famously, we just had a commemoration of it, Jesus famously enters Jerusalem. That is called what? In our current religious calendar, that is what? What is it? Palm Sunday. Okay. So Matthew chapter 21 begins the markation of the final week of Jesus' life. And he has these particular days that are going on. He enters on a Sunday, and then we've got Monday and Tuesday. Tuesday is where we have a long block of teaching. And so he's not just teaching, but he's challenging. Matthew chapter 23, famously, what is in Matthew chapter 23? Jesus versus who? The Pharisees, right. And we get down to the end of Matthew chapter 23. After he has condemned them soundly, publicly, he basically tells them, what are you going to do to me? You're going to reject me and you're going to kill me. And you look down in chapter 37 and in chapter 23, verse 37, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings. But what? You were not willing. You were not willing. There's a lot of time. I wrote a little blurb on this on Facebook one time. But you were not willing. There's so many times. Again, hearkening back to the lesson, as imperfect as it might seem, there's a lot of people who want to help you, who want to make you better. Sometimes that's done in a very positive, upbeat way, and sometimes it isn't. And I will just assure you that my molding of character as a gospel preacher has sometimes been in a very nice, pleasant, gentle way, and sometimes it's been in a harsh and ugly way. But all of those have made me who I am today, for better or for worse. So there's lots of people who want to help you. The question is always what? Are you willing? Are you willing? I would have taken you like a chicken gathers her chicks under her wing, but you what? You were not willing. So now he has to begin to talk about their punishment for rejecting him. And what was their punishment going to be? The destruction of Jerusalem. Now, in a sense, was the destruction of Jerusalem a moot point? Because think, what did Jerusalem represent to the Jews? It represented the old law, because that's where you went. That was the center point of worshiping God. Well, when Jesus dies on the cross, what happens? Well, now the new covenant comes into effect. The old covenant is done away. Romans chapter 10, Jesus was the end of the law. And that end didn't mean just in a linear point. When he died, that was the end. He meant that he was the fulfillment of it. And so when he dies on the cross, everything that the law had talked about was now what? Fulfilled. And now we move on to something that's good and better. Was the destruction of Jerusalem a moot point? Because if the old law is being dismantled, wasn't it already dismantled when Jesus died on the cross? It was. So why have the destruction of Jerusalem? God physically had to show the Jews what? That the old law didn't mean anything, and that what, Denise? And that Jesus was the new law. Along with, God had to show the Jews that you cannot do what? You can't keep going with the law, and you can't reject Jesus as the Messiah. The often repeated phrase, at least I've tried to repeat it often, is that God judges nations in time and He judges mankind in eternity. All through the Old Testament, you've got God judging nations in time. And they're either judged because they have all kinds of natural problems that come to them, disease, famine, floods. They're judged in time. They have invaders come and take them over. They're judged in time. The Jews are going to be judged in time. You can make the argument that by the time you get to the end of the Gospels, there's essentially only one people left to be judged in time. And I think there's a very good case to be made for that. And we're going to be looking at that in two more passages. Next time is 2 Thessalonians chapter 3. And then the final time after that is Revelation 20. And then we'll move on to something else. But the book of Revelation is about, I think, one final group of people being judged in time. And that's going to be the Roman Empire. So God has to show that when you reject Jesus, you what? There's nothing left. And there is a what? There's a consequence to that. You know, we learn when we teach our children in life, every decision has a what? A consequence, good and bad, but every decision has a consequence. So the Jews are having to learn the consequential nature of what it means to reject Jesus Christ. So He tells them, when you get to chapter 24, verse 1, Jesus went out, He departs from the temple. The disciples came to show Him the buildings of the temple. You know, at that point, what was the temple like? Whose temple was it, by the way? It was Herod's temple. And what did it look like? What did it look like? Should have brought pictures. There's a model in Jerusalem now that shows it's the best look that we've got of it. It was, in a word, magnificent. Magnificent. There's only a part of it left. What part of that is left? The western or the Wailing Wall, those blocks, the ones that the Orthodox Jews pray in front of, and they slip pieces of paper in the cracks, those pieces are original. But what does Jesus say is going to happen in verse 2? Right. Do you not see all of these? I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down. Well, to the disciples, you can imagine that was what? That got their attention. So what did they ask in verse 3? Okay, when will these things be? Now, this was a monumental amount of teaching. So it is repeated in Mark 13 and also in Luke 21. Some of them don't give all three questions, but Matthew records three questions, okay? When will it be? What will be the sign of your coming? And then what? What will be the end of the age? And there was, and I believe it was J.W. McGarvey who gave I think a pretty decent explanation of this, because when you read those three questions, two of them immediately make sense. Okay? The first two, when will it be and what will be the signs? It's the third one that what? That throws, you don't really know what to make. J.W. McGarvey offered this explanation, and it makes a lot of sense to me. Again, I'll admit it gives some weight, although there may be alternative ideas behind it. The Jews thought, these disciples, remember, they were still Jews. when Jesus comes and basically says that this temple is going to be completely dismantled, the only thing that they could liken it to is what? The end of the world. And so naturally their thoughts are to tie together the end of the world with this great dismantling of everything that's going to come. So then at that point, what does Jesus set out to do, starting in verse 4? Yes, absolutely. He explains what the signs are. So, presumably in verse 4, that no one what? That no one deceives you. Even back then, you always have problems in a religious sense of people trying to do what? Deceive you. Always. Even back then, religiously speaking, people are always going to try to deceive you. So he gives them a lot of signs. In fact, it's kind of tricky to enumerate, but there's actually 10 different signs that Jesus gave. And in those 10 signs, as you go back and you look at secular history, those signs were fulfilled. Because think about in what was the first sign that he mentions in verse 5? Well, in the 5th verse, even before that, you're going to have false Christ. I am the Christ. And he's going, well, when you look back in history, there were several false Christs. Then he moves on to wars and rumors of wars. He moves on. 7, nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes. You go back in history, in the Roman Empire, in the areas that surround the land of Palestine. And certainly, there were all of these occurrences. So when he's giving them signs, he's telling them that when you see these signs, what should you do? You leave. Yes, you leave. In 9, they'll deliver you up to tribulation. They'll kill you. You'll be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And many will be offended. They'll betray one another. They'll hate one another. False prophets will rise up, deceive many. And because lawlessness will abound, what will happen in verse 12? The love of many will grow cold. Because, if we get to it, yes, we'll get to it. Because the fulfillment of this isn't going to come immediately. We'll see the time frame of it in just a second. But in verse 13, he who endures to the end will what? Be saved. This is quoted a lot. I've quoted it a lot. And I need to, maybe I don't always explain it. But in the context, what is Jesus talking about? The people who learn the signs, remember the signs, then take action when the signs come, and don't lose heart. Don't let their love grow cold. What will happen to those people? They will be saved. Okay. Now in pulling it out of, admittedly, in pulling it out of the context, can you make a spiritual application to it? The people who hear the gospel, the people who obey the gospel, and then the people who live by the gospel, in the end, what will happen to them? They will be saved. So when someone quotes this passage, in all likelihood, yes, they know that it's being taken out of context. But the spiritual application fits perfectly along with the physical one with this destruction of Jerusalem. The gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all of the world as a witness to all of the nations. And then what will happen? The end will come. The end of what? Because when you have something like the end will come, it always depends on one major consideration. What does the context say? Paul had said himself in Colossians chapter 1, verse 23, that at that point, when did Paul write Colossians? We've been studying it back in our class on Wednesday. When did Paul write Colossians? It was one of his prison letters. And he wrote those prison letters in early 60 AD, about 30 years after Jesus is saying this, somewhere in that neighborhood. A few years after that, Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. So when Jesus says that the gospel has been preached in all of the world, 30 years later, Paul is basically going to say what? It has been preached in all of the world. So then we have in 15. When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. This comes from Daniel, two primary places, Daniel chapter 9, Daniel chapter 7, but specifically here in Daniel chapter 9, because Daniel chapter 9 lays out a time frame. Now it's highly symbolic, but of how many weeks? 70 weeks. And people who believe that Matthew chapter 24 relates to a premillennial concept believe that this is all happening in that final week of the 70 weeks. So the abomination of desolation, which Daniel spoke of, when you look at the other passages, they help us. That's one of the reasons why we have multiple copies of the gospel, is because they all tell a little bit different in the accounts of Jesus. You harmonize them, and they really, really help us out. What does Luke chapter 21, verse 20 say? Someone read Luke chapter 21, verse 20. Because there's a lot of people who would believe that the abomination of desolation relates to what in today's thinking? The end of the world, or the rapture, the tribulation and the rapture. So someone read Luke 21:20. So the abomination of desolation, Matthew leaves it somewhat opaque, but Luke comes in and explains exactly when the abomination of desolation takes place. And when was it? It was during the destruction of Jerusalem. And then Matthew goes on just to notice a handful of other things. In verse 16, when all of this takes place, what should you do? You should flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house. Let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. Woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days, and pray not that your flight may not be in the winter or on the Sabbath. You know, it's not going to be an easy thing, but you've got to what? You've got to flee, because it will be, in verse 21, a great what? A great tribulation, such as has not been seen since the beginning of the world until this time, nor ever shall be. Now people take that language and they talk about a tribulation, they talk about a battle of Armageddon, and that battle is going to be unlike anything that's ever seen. In the context, what does it mean? In the context, what does it mean? In 21, Jerusalem is going to what? Be destroyed. It's going to be attacked and it's going to be destroyed. In fact, it's going to be so harsh, they've never what? They've never seen anything like it before. You know, Jesus was a fan. I thought about us eventually going over and looking at essentially the way that the Bible expresses itself. So the way that figurative language, but it is kind of dry. So I've kind of fought that tendency. But Jesus was someone who spoke a lot in hyperbole. What does hyperbole mean? It means you exaggerate. And when you exaggerate, you what? Exactly. The exaggeration is what makes the point. So, having said that, are there other times when you can think of Jesus using very exaggerated language? when you think about the wealthy. How hard is it for the wealthy to go into heaven? That's what? That's exaggeration. That's hyperbole. When you fight with your significant other, and your significant other has complained about you taking out the trash 4 times, you say to them, "You have told me about that how many times?" 1,000. It's always 1,000. Why is it always 1,000? But it is. It's always 1,000. Is that accurate? No, not even close to it. But what are you doing? You're exaggerating to make your point. I don't recommend it, by the way. I don't recommend it. I've tried to remove all of that from my language with my significant other because it usually doesn't end well. Nevertheless, you're using hyperbole. Jesus used hyperbole. And in this section in verse 21, it's going to be a great tribulation. Such as like what? Such like the beginning. So, when you see this city being attacked and being destroyed, no one's ever seen Jerusalem taken apart like this. That's all that it means. Is it a little bit over the top? From my point of view, admittedly, yes. But Jesus was a famous user of exaggerated language to try to make a point. When you see it, you need to run. And if you'll run, if you'll endure to the end, you're going to be saved. In verse 23, let's just pull up some of these other ideas, especially I wanted to get to this one that I'd brought up earlier. If anyone says, "Look, here is the Christ," or "There," do not believe it. False Christs and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. So no one's above what? You're right. No one's above being deceived. See, I have told you beforehand. Let's look at in verse 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, again, what takes place? Sun is darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then the Son of Man will appear in the heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. So let's come back to that. In verse 29, this is very, very important to understand. What is verse 29? What is verse 29? It is Judgment Day. What Judgment Day? The Jews' Judgment Day. What day was it? Whatever day that the Roman, they laid siege, by the way, to Rome for a long, long time. The idea that when you watch a movie and they lay siege to the city and then like an hour later they go into it, that was not the way it happened. How long did sieges last? Sometimes months. If I'm not mistaken, I'll have to go back and brush up on. If I'm not mistaken, and I might be confusing this with the Babylonians, I think the Romans sieged Jerusalem for about 1.5 years. It was a long, long time. So eventually, when Jerusalem gave up and they went into the city and they tore it all to pieces, that was going to be like what? Verse 29, like what? It's going to be like Judgment Day. And here's the critical part. This is the part that you have to remember. I won't give it to you here because you'll never remember it all. But if you ever talk to anyone, this is the critical part. In verse 29, you're looking at language and you're thinking, wow, that's fantastic, overblown language of judgment. But the Old Testament prophets used this kind of language all of the time. And it would be language that would talk about the Babylonians destroying the Assyrians. It would be language talking about the Babylonians who go and they take the people of Judah into captivity. It would be language that would talk about the Persians defeating the Babylonians. So it's the language of judgment, if you will. apocalyptic, again, very exaggerated, very figurative, very overblown? Absolutely. But it was the language of judgment. It appears a dozen times in the Old Testament. So when Jesus takes that kind of language and He expresses it, He's just saying that Jerusalem is going to undergo the same kind of judgment that so many of the nations back in the Old Testament underwent. That's all He's saying. He's not bringing it into a period of time where there's going to be a tribulation and then a battle of Armageddon. It's just the language of judgment. So you've got to remember that, or else the whole section just doesn't really seem to make any sense. So we have then this judgment, and this picture of judgment in 30, where the tribes of the earth will mourn. They'll see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. He'll send His angels with a great sound of the trumpet. People will think this is what? Or people today think this is what? This is going to be the great rapture. The rapture comes along. Battle of tribulation, the battle of Armageddon is fought. The rapture comes along. We've got 1,000-year reign on Christ. So all of this is at the end of the world. And then in 31, this great sound of the trumpet, they'll gather together His elect from all four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So what does all that mean? What does all of that mean? The Lord comes in judgment. And again, the angels gathering the elect. How do the angels gather the elect? The Lord's just said what? If you listen to these signs and you run, what will happen? You'll be saved. So it can be said that when they are saved, God actually did what? God actually saved them. God protected them. We always pray, Lord, please be with me. Please protect me from this hurricane that's coming. What's the number one way that you can be protected from the hurricane that's coming? It's when you learn about a hurricane, you what? You leave. So here Jesus was giving all these signs. If they left, then God was what? God was protecting them because He told them what to do. He'd even told them how it was all going to come to pass. And that's just simply what these verses mean. He kind of ends with the parable of the fig tree. When the branch is ready, it does what? It brings forth leaves. Summer is near. So these signs are going to take just a little bit of time. We'll talk about that before we leave. These signs are going to take a little bit of time. And if you'll endure to the end, you will what? You will be saved. Okay, so let's talk about the fulfillment real quick. When we get down to verse 30, when we get down to verse 34, let's go ahead and talk about that before time runs out. So this generation will by no means pass away until all of these things take place. How long does a generation last? How long does a generation last? Roughly speaking, about 40-ish years, give or take. Jesus spoke these words in about 30 AD. When did the Romans come and take the city of Jerusalem? In 70 AD. So from the time of 30 to the time of 70 was 40 years, or about a what? About a generation. So the Lord was going to give them these signs, but it wasn't going to happen immediately. You were going to have to what? Remember, watch, be patient, just like the fig tree. When the blooms start, you know what? Summer is near. So when you start seeing these signs occur, what will you know? That the time is near. You need to run and get out of here, because the whole place is going to come crumbling down. Now, in the aftermath, it has been reported that there weren't Christians who lost their lives. There were a lot of Jews who were killed, but Christians didn't lose their lives because presumably These truths were taught in Jerusalem for 40 years. And when they knew, when they learned, when they saw it, they left. Now, we're going to talk about the significance of that next time and then look at the greater lesson for us today, which is going to be in 25.